Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this important discussion tonight. I am Jennifer Marshall. I'm the co-founder and executive director of This Is My Brave, and I am joined by three esteemed guests. I'm so excited to introduce you to them, and I'm going to let them do their own introductions, but we're joined by Allison Gerber and Anastasia Vlasova and Desiree Vyas. So let's start with Allison. If you could give us your brief intro, Allison.
Sure. I'm Allison Gerber. I am the author of Braced, Focused, and most recently, my newest book, Taking Up Space, just came out on Tuesday. All of my books are published by Scholastic. They are for readers 8 years old and up. So 8 years old, and the adults who love them, teachers, librarians, parents. My latest book is about a girl named Sarah, who is a superstar basketball player. She's struggling to feel good about her body and herself, and it's based on my struggles with self-worth, disordered eating, body image, and food in general. I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Allison. Yes, such important topics that are covered in your recent book, and we're going to be touching on that during our discussion. Thanks for being here. Anastasia, how about your intro?
Hi, I'm Anastasia. I'm 18. I'm a senior in high school right now. I am the creative director of This Is My Brave Teens, which is a mental health advocacy platform located mainly on Instagram. And we showcase a lot of teens' mental health stories and different resources for teens that are related to mental health and mental illness and mental wellness. And I'm also the host of the Brave Wave podcast, which is currently on pause, but it will be coming out very soon. So get excited for that. And I'm also the host of this upcoming documentary with This Is My Brave, where we're going around and interviewing all of the amazing teens that have been involved with the This Is My Brave National Teen Show. And I'll be attending NYU in the fall. So I'm excited for that. Thanks for having me.
Awesome, Anastasia. Thanks so much. I'm actually repping the National Teen shirt. We have merchandise. So the teen show is coming up on Sunday, sneak peek event. So we'll drop links for that. But thanks for being here tonight. And Desiree, will you introduce yourself for everyone?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Jen, thank you so much for having me. My name is Dr. Desiree Vyas. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and school psychologist. I work in one of the largest counties in the country, Loudoun County Public Schools. I primarily work with elementary students. My specializations are in ADHD, parent management training, and behavioral management.
Fantastic. We're so appreciative to all of you for being here and for everyone tuning in. This is a really important topic. It's the middle of Mental Health Awareness Month, as everyone I'm sure is aware. We're all, raising awareness, and part of This Is My Brave, our big mission is to provide this platform where people can tell their stories, because when we share openly about what we've gone through, it gives others the permission to do the same. It breaks down that stigma that prevents a lot of people from seeking help. And it's my firm belief as a parent to 2 little ones, I have a 10-year-old and a 12-year-old, that we need to start really early in talking to our kids about mental health. And so that's kind of where I wanted to start our discussion. And as folks are listening in, share with us where you're tuning in from. We'd love to hear from you. We can chat over here. But also, if you think of a question as we're talking here, please drop it in the Ask a Question box down there, and we will work on those at the end as we get through a couple starter questions. So first, I'd love to throw out there to everyone, why do we think, I kind of shared my own personal view, but why do we think it's important to start at an early age to have these discussions about mental health and mental wellness? Who might want to start?
Do you want to start?
Wait, you want me to start? Go ahead, Allison. Go ahead.
Thank you. I feel really strongly that kids live tough topics. They just are living in a world that's reality. Whether we want that to be true or not, we want to protect them as much as possible. And so we don't want them to have to confront these difficult and sometimes painful and complicated topics. But the truth is that most of them are already confronting them every single day in all different kind of ways, whether that's through relationships they have with other kids who are going through difficult things, or they have parents who are going through something that might be a challenge. They're just experiencing the world. And so it's better for them to have a space to talk about it and to process what they're seeing and observing, and really truly from a really young age, this is happening. I can share that I had an incident this week as a parent. I have a 3.5-year-old, and it really, it made me realize, like, oh, we're going to be talking about these. I mean, I knew we would be talking about these things young because it's so important to me, but I didn't realize I was surprised. It's quite young. And it really made me, like, I take my own advice and say, like, okay, let's make space for this. Let's make space for everybody's feelings. It's really important, and that kids feel validated, that they feel heard and seen, and that whatever it is they're going through, even if it feels as an adult outside of that experience, maybe feels small and not so important, that we really take a minute to see, like, this is the first time that my child is confronting this. This is actually huge. Mm-hmm. This is changing their perspective of the world. This little perspective has now opened up. So the more we can engage with the difficult topics that they're already facing, the easier it will be for them to advocate for themselves, to get help when they need help, to know to recognize when something isn't right for themselves, and also for friends, to be able to advocate and stand up for friends and encourage their friends to ask for help. And when do you call an adult?
Mm-hmm. Really good points.
Very good points, Allison. Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you. I mean, young people today are faced with so many different things. And to give our audience just kind of a general definition of mental health, it's really the psychological, emotional, and behavioral functioning, right? And it really impacts the way we think, the way we feel, and the way we act. And so all of those things are so important. What I like telling my patients and my students is to think about mental health kind of on a continuum. We have, mental illness maybe on one end and then mental wellness on the other. And there's this huge continuum in the middle. And, we all fall at different places at different times. And so I think, normalizing these conversations kind of ends that stigma. Being able to normalize and being able to relate, how certain topics are relatable to, our kids. And the easiest way to kind of do that is, through association. And so when you think about learning principles as a whole, we learn through association. And the best way to kind of do that is when we're talking about mental health is to kind of relate it to something that they are very familiar with. And I know one way to do this is really kind of relating that mental health piece with that physical health piece. I think that's something that is very much missed. And so I think, giving those examples of, hey, let me give you a script. So, a physical piece, talking about your physical health. People get sick, right? They go to the doctor, they have a cold, they have a flu. It impacts their daily functioning. It impacts what they do at school. Mom and dad may not go to work. Well, the same thing happens to the brain, right? And so we get sick sometimes, and sometimes we need to get treatment for that. So explaining it through that way, through an association that your child understands, find out what makes sense to them, they're going to better able to remember that and apply it.
Yes, I agree, Desi. And for me personally, our family went through an experience together. I live with type 1 bipolar disorder, and, associating it with that spectrum is exactly how I look at my bipolar disorder. My goal is always to stay, for me, healthy is kind of in the middle. It's balanced. It's a 5 on a 10-point scale. When I am experiencing mania, it's towards the level 10, that's a dangerous area, 9, 10. So I want to stay in that 5, 6 area. When I get to a 1, that might be depression, really bad depression. And so as a family, we went through an experience where I had a manic episode, and the kids saw the beginning of that manic episode, and it was really scary. But my kids had never seen their mom sick from the bipolar. That I had always been healthy, because my episodes before that were before they were born. And it was a starting point for us as a family. My daughter was 7 at the time, my son 9. And they then went through therapy. I had to go to the hospital, and it was, again, associating that physical condition. If someone were having a heart attack, they would be in the hospital, So mommy had an episode with her illness. She went to the hospital to go see the doctors to get well. And, that was something age appropriate. They were able to understand that and help them comprehend. And then I come home and I'm able to get back to being mom and being healthy. And it really started us on a journey as a family of having those open conversations about how we take care of our mental health. Like, balancing with the screen time and balancing with making sure we get good exercise throughout the week, and different good sleep is big in our house. So that's kind of from my perspective. But Anastasia, I'd be curious to hear from your perspective as a teenager, why maybe you wish you would have, learned more about mental health at a younger age.
Yeah, so many reasons why I wish I would have learned about it at a younger age. But I think the primary one is I think middle school is a very difficult time for a lot of young people, and obviously it comes directly after elementary school. And I think that during those 2 years, or at least my middle school was 2, I know it varies from place to place, but for me, when I entered middle school, I was just bombarded with so many new experiences, and a lot of them were also very negative experiences. Like I started experiencing severe anxiety for the first time. I started noticing the issues and conflicts going on within my family, and I started noticing other things and friendships changing, and how my body was changing, and my body image was changing, and all of it was kind of changing for the worse, honestly. And I think that that's applicable to a lot of other people during that age period that I talked to. And I think that if we were taught about mental health and how to take preventative measures to avoid mental illness or getting to those really extreme states of certain like anxiety, for example, or depression or something, then we would be able to kind of avoid going down the hole that I went through and falling into this dark abyss of all of these negative, uncomfortable emotions and not knowing how to get out, And so I think that the earlier we teach our children to take care of their mental health and what mental illness is and normalize the conversation, I think the better prepared they will be for when they get older and when they start experiencing all of these new changes and they don't really have many people, say, in their family or friend groups to turn to. They'll know to go to an adult, perhaps a counselor or another trusted adult, or they would know that maybe they need to seek therapy or something, or they need to exercise or develop more of a balanced routine and stuff. And so I think that it's just important to educate kids about these things that they're inevitably going to experience at an older age, which is why it doesn't make sense to me why we don't teach our kids these things. Because, I mean, we all know, especially during your teenage years, you're going through so many changes constantly and you're meeting so many people and you're being introduced to so many environments. And I think the number one thing that's most important in these situations is your mental health and learning to care for it and nurture it and everything, yet we're not taught to do so. And so I think it's important to teach kids about mental health because based on my personal experience, I think that many of the internal conflicts I experienced during adolescence could have been avoided or at least minimized if I were to receive that education at a younger age. So, yeah.
Anastasia, you bring up such an excellent point of us as a society as being more reactive than proactive, right? Mm-hmm. And if you think about a waterfall, we tend to catch the problems as things are coming down instead of backing it up right before things go down.
Right.
And so you're absolutely correct with being more proactive. And I know, within the county that I'm working in, we're starting to talk more about social emotional learning and adding that piece to the curriculum for kids in elementary school. Mm-hmm. So hopefully it just keeps improving from here.
Yeah, definitely.
One of the things that I thought was so interesting that you just said was that everybody's going to sort of experience something and going to experience some sort of conflict and where your mental health might be impacted. And it's true. We don't really think of mental health as a thing that everyone has. Like as a society, we don't talk about it that way. Like we all have health and we all have mental health.
We all have a brain, right?
Yeah, we all have a brain and as you move from childhood to adulthood, you're going to go through change. Mm-hmm. And as you change, your body physically changes, your brain changes. Everybody around you is changing and you're going through that for the first time. Why should you have to do that alone? Mm-hmm. This change is going to result in conflict. It's going to result in growing pains. We think about growing pains as being physical, but they're also mental, emotional, and social. And there's like all these different layers. And one of the reasons I write books for kids, I write books, my characters are all 12 years old, but kids read up. So kids start reading at 8 to see what it's going to be like when they're 12. One of the reasons I write for this age group is because for me, fiction, and whether that was through TV shows or books, was really a way to build empathy and to see myself reflected and my own pain and my own experience reflected. And I felt like I also was one of those kids who sort of had like a trickle down effect where it was like it started as small problems and then all of a sudden the waterfall came and nobody knew what to do with me because I had undiagnosed ADHD and scoliosis. Like I had everything that was going on. And the waterfall came and there was no support and I was totally alone. But in fiction, I found support and I found friendship and I found my own reflection, right back at me. And I think that it's always a good place to turn, is to think about, like, are there stories that can help us understand ourselves better, that can help us understand other people better, especially stories that help, like, are sort of saying, like, therapy is a good thing and educating yourself is a good thing and supporting your kids early on is a good thing.
Well, that brings me, Allison, I have to bring up the fact that my daughter and I just read your book, Taking Up Space, and we read it together. And I would encourage every parent out there with a middle-aged child, I mean, anywhere from 8 to up through middle school. It's, my daughter's 10 and we sat, and every night we would read a chapter or two, and the story just drove home the fact that these kids, as you mentioned at the top of the discussion, are going through so many different things, and they're changing, and just being able to have a story open up that conversation for us was so powerful. And we were touching on everything from puberty, coming up, and relationships and crushes, and and then the disordered eating, and actually that brings me to one of my first a question that came up through a discussion outside of this event, but I think it's relevant to bring up, and this might be a good time. I was telling someone about how Vivi and I had just read Taking Up Space, and the person said, well, if my child has never, had any occurrence of disordered eating or has never been exposed to it, and then we read this story, could that put the idea into their head? And to me, that was really interesting. And I'll share first my perspective, and then I'd love to hear everyone else's perspective. But it reminded me of the myth that when, if you ask someone who, if you're worried about them, that they might be suicidal, and you say, are you thinking of taking your life? That's a very hard question to ask, of course, but it doesn't put the idea into their head. It shows them that you're caring and you're noticing what they're going through, and that you're there for them and you want to support them in their recovery. And it really starts a deep, important conversation. And I think that that's what it made me think of, but I'm curious to hear everybody else's perspective.
Yeah, I would completely agree with you, Jen, in the sense of, and we had this discussion a little bit, right? And so merely just talking about eating disorder or talking about suicide is not going to plant the seed in your child. Absolutely not. And it's actually, it will help your child. It will let your child know that you're there for them and you're willing to communicate about very, very important topics, and kind of open that line of discussion. I think what people get confused with is merely just talking about a specific disorder or something like suicide, and then comparing that with kind of romanticizing about it. And so there's this romanticizing around suicide that actually it can impact. It can be one of those risk factors with suicide. And, as I mentioned in a previous discussion, that romanticizing, this is why schools are sometimes very, very careful with doing memorials when the child commits suicide, to kind of prevent that suicide contagion. So the answer to the question of merely talking about eating disorders or having that come up in a novel is not going to have your child engage in disordered eating.
Yeah,
I would also... Oh, no, you go first. I'll go after you.
Okay. I wanted to touch on that because I actually had an eating disorder throughout middle school and the majority of high school. I had binge eating disorder. And as I was starting to do therapy and I was doing a lot of reflection about my childhood, I noticed that a lot of these signs of body image issues and eating disorders started developing very early on in around 5th grade. And I didn't really notice it at the time that something was going on that I should be concerned about. I thought that it was just kind of a normal, slightly unusual and new thought that was going through my head, but I didn't think too much of it. And eventually it manifested into a full-blown eating disorder that took 5 years to eventually recover from. And so I think that now that we have authors like you, Allison, who are writing about these issues that really do heavily impact young people, I think that it's really important that kids read these types of books and be familiarize themselves with these different issues that could potentially arise within their minds. Because I think that if I were given a book to read about an disordered eating or a girl who's going through disordered eating, I think that would have put it on my radar, and I would have kind of started noticing my own thought patterns and behaviors a bit more, and potentially would have caught my eating disorder much earlier on and sought help, instead of just waiting it out several years and trying to do it on my own and thinking that I was the only one going through this too, And I think also, I think Jenn and Desi touched on this earlier, but I just wanted to say that whenever there are products out there or books about these types of topics, especially when they're meant for young age groups, like kids who are in elementary school, I think it's important to remember that these books aren't meant to teach your kids to diagnose themselves. I think it's simply about raising awareness and developing that consciousness within themselves, to look out for these different signs. And if they notice them, then to seek help. It's not about teaching them to say, oh, I have depression, I have to act depressed, I have to do this and this and this. It's not about that. I think it's more so just reminding them that they should take care of their minds, they should take care of their bodies. And if there's some sort of sign that that they're concerned about, then they should seek help. So I really don't think that it's much of an issue. And I think, honestly, we need more books like yours, Allison. So, yeah.
And I have to point out Katie's comment in the chat too. She said the book really did also teach loving yourself. That concept of self-love is something that I don't think is taught nearly enough in, childhood. But Allison, what were you going to say?
No, I completely agree. And I was just thinking, you said it perfectly, Anastasia. You, thank you for sharing your own experience. And I know we've talked about it in relationship to taking up space, that it would be really impossible for somebody, it would be improbable for somebody, a young person, to not experience diet culture and disorder. So diet culture is the society we live in, which values our weight, size, and shape over our actual well-being. And disordered eating, because we sort of jumped into this without sort of defining it. So I'll just take a step back and say disordered eating is anything from compulsive dieting to restricting and binging to a preoccupation with food and body. Just that it's always on your mind. A lot of what I struggled with, and even into adulthood as I got help, and one of the biggest hurdles for me was taking and having a negative experience, challenge, a hurdle, and having negative self-talk and being in a cycle of negative self-talk that resulted in my restricting of my food, and then ultimately binging, and then self-punishing. So that sort of cycle, the mental cycle for me was the biggest hurdle to overcome. And it takes up, the reason the book is taking up space is it takes up so much space in your mind. And when food is taking up that much space in your mind, it's sucking all the other energy out of you that you could be devoting to doing things you love, that make you happy, that, fuel you in other ways. And I think for me, the biggest step toward true recovery was when I face a challenge, was not turning to food as anything. Like, when food does not take up space in my mind, I know I'm there, and I'm so proud. Like, I can take a moment to say, like, that's triumphant moment. It was hard for me to get there. And I think a lot of the reason it was hard for me to get there was because it was so normalized. This idea of compulsively dieting and shrinking yourself was so sort of ingrained into me, and it's natural for it to be ingrained into us. Diet culture has been around since the early 1800s. And so it's been passed down through generations and generations and generations. It's almost like a bad family tradition, like a toxic family tradition that feels so familiar that we should, it's like normal that everybody does that, but it's like not normal, and it's so bad for us. And the more we can say, name it and say, like, if something says guilt-free, like, no, guilt and food should not be associated with it. Like, call it out, name it, say it, and then we can all move, to try to move forward. And I hope this book just starts to crush diet culture slowly until it's not there anymore.
Oh, I loved the message. I loved I won't spoil the ending, but the theme throughout too of the crush and how they engaged and they cooked together, and that was such a joy for them, and there was an exciting moment at the end. So yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, we need to be having these, maybe uncomfortable, but such important conversations. Okay, so another thing I want to touch on, and we do have a couple questions that have been coming in, but tools. So books are a great tool. There's a link down here to order Taking Up Space if you want to go check that out and buy a copy. But another tool that we use in our family for meditation, Insight Timer. So an app where you can, log in and find different quick meditations that teach the kids about being present in the moment and helping your body relax and prepare for sleep. That's mainly how we use it, but I know you can use it in different ways. I wondered if anyone had any tips on tools to build that mental health toolkit and engage with kids.
So yeah, I have some tidbits and some pointers, especially for parents in this area. I know I definitely need to jump on that technology train and start testing these out myself. So I'm not going to promote a specific one, but I definitely want to give parents kind of some guide points as they're selecting, because right now there's over 10,000 mental health apps. That's a lot to choose from. Mm-hmm. And I think they say something between 3 and 5% are actually evidence-based, right? So there's a lot to choose out there. One thing that I found to be extremely helpful, and I think parents would find this really valuable, is Cyber Guide. And have you heard of that, Jenn?
I know the family that created it, the Staglin family. Yeah.
Yes, it's fantastic because what it does is it filters everything down. So, if there's a specific symptom, specific disorder, a treatment modality like cognitive behavioral therapy, so you could kind of filter it down, and then it gives you a selection of certain apps. And then what it also does is it rates its credibility, its platform, its audience, and even goes down to cost. So that would be one way I think parents could kind of, a good place to start, because there are so many out there. And then another thing that I thought was really valuable is there's something called Let's Get Technical. It's through the American Psychological Association. And again, it gives parents, anyone for that matter, really just guide points of what you should be looking for in an app. And one I thought was the evidence base, right? So either, has it been based on a clinical study? Has a psychologist made it? So really looking for that research. Another thing is to keep in mind of your privacy. So how is your data being used? I think that's really, really important, since everything we do today is they're collecting data, right? And so you really want to know how that's used. So I thought that those two resources in the selection of a specific app were very, very useful.
I think that's great. I dropped the link to Cyber Guide in the chat.
Perfect.
Brandon Staglin, the son of Garen Staglin, Garen and Sherry, shared his story in our Napa Valley show. I think it was 2017. I'm trying to remember the exact year, but they do incredible work at One Mind. So definitely check out Cyber Guide and find an app that is evidence-based and research-backed. Allison or Anastasia have any ideas on tools?
So I don't use any technology for anything like this. I have ADHD, and I have found that anything on my phone just gets lost in some note somewhere, or it gets downloaded and I never use it. So one of the things, I'm a firm believer in regular therapy. Mm-hmm. I think one of the challenges I've actually heard from a lot of parents recently is like, how do I find the right therapist for my child? And I'm wondering actually if, Desi, if you wouldn't mind weighing in on that. I can give my little opinion, but it's just my opinion. I'm an author. I'm not a psychologist. Yeah. And, I'm a person who's been to therapy, and I think it's really important to, like with anything else, to meet with a couple of different people and to think about what are you looking for? What's the connection? Now the tricky part I always find with these kind of relationships is if you're in a difficult place, your child is in a difficult place, sometimes you pick a connection that might be a little bit not good for you. So somebody might be giving you something that feels familiar, but maybe familiar in a bad way. I definitely experienced this when I was looking for a therapist when I was at my lowest moment. And so for me, I really tried to push myself outside my comfort zone and say, I want to find somebody who approaches me with kindness and empathy, who makes me feel seen and heard and validated, but who's willing to question the people in my life and some of the things that they were doing, and also say why, not question the decisions I make, but help me to evaluate some of the decisions, and at the time, destructive decisions I was making, and to consider how I could approach something in a different way. And that you can really find out in a 45-minute phone call or a 15-minute check-in with somebody. You can get a sense of if the person is how they're approaching you. Is it with kindness and empathy? That's like those are the number one things to be looking for. That's my opinion, personal opinion.
No, Allison, you hit on a couple major points, and really you want to be able to connect and develop that rapport with your therapist. If that's not there, the communication is not going to be open, and therapy as a result is not going to work out. But one thing, I'm very strong on evidence-based, and something that I tell parents at the schools that I work at is look at effectivechildtherapy.org. I love this site because what it is it goes by, again, certain symptoms, and then the evidence-based approaches that kind of support those symptoms. So I'll give you an example. With ADHD, research supports behavioral modification and behavioral parent training as the modes of therapy to support that. So, when I hear a child doing play therapy and they have ADHD, that's not the best or most effective way of kind of getting through to the child, because it's really about the behavioral modification. Another thing I especially tell parents is making sure you are in the therapy session with your child, or play a very active role. It is hard to have a young elementary child in therapy. And so really what that's going to be about is that parent management piece, right? So the parent is going to be getting those strategies and then really being able to implement that, because what happens outside of therapy room is really the magic, right? Mm-hmm. There's so much you could do in those 45 minutes. You teach those strategies, but then you have to go out and practice. Mm-hmm. And I always even tell my patients, it's like working out, right? You could get those strategies from a trainer, but then you've got to carry it out every day. So it's the same thing when you're working on, cognitive behavioral types of strategies. So effectivetherapychild.org is highly recommended. And then really developing that rapport with your therapist, and then having that open communication about previous therapists. So what did work with a previous therapist? What didn't work? I don't want to repeat those things. Mm-hmm. I think there's some considerations to take as you're looking for a therapist.
That's great.
Well, Anastasia, do you have anything to add?
Yes. Yeah. This is coming from a teen's perspective, but I think it's still applicable to younger people as well. Not that I'm not young. You guys know what I mean, like elementary school age people. One thing that I learned from going to therapy from my therapist is this technique that I try to implement when I speak to other people, and I notice myself starting to judge them unnecessarily, and that is to remove my glasses. So basically, my therapist always says that everyone, or usually everyone, especially those who haven't gone to therapy and haven't done this inner work, walk around with these glasses on, which means that they're kind of viewing everything from their own filter that's made up of like their own childhood traumas and their own experiences and all of these projections that they might put on other people and everything. And so when someone is coming to you with something that they're struggling with, say they're really upset, and they tell you about it, and you notice your mind's immediately going to a place of judgment and negativity and maybe criticism towards them, remember that that's happening because you're wearing your glasses. So you need to take them off and just to basically welcome them with empathy and kindness, and just treat them and validate their feelings, because they are valid. Everyone's feelings are valid. And just because they're going through something that you might personally not think they should be getting sad because of, doesn't mean that their feelings aren't valid. Doesn't mean that their sadness isn't valid. And so that's just a tip that I have like attempted to tell my mom about that, because I think sometimes we don't quite align when it comes to feelings, and me telling her about the emotions I'm experiencing, especially because, she grew up in a generation that didn't really talk about mental health. Like validating feelings really wasn't a thing. Like there was no concept of that. And sometimes she tells me I'm like too emotional or whatever, or like my generation is so soft and all of this. But I just know that it's because there's a huge misalignment between our generations and just the things that we're taught about mental health and emotions, and how to practice empathy, and how to basically accept people as they are. And so I think that as parents, a tip that I would give to you to kind of implement when you're talking to your kids about what they're going through is to just remove your glasses. And I think Allison kind of touched on this earlier in the very beginning when she was saying how these kids, like they're very young, most of the things that they're experiencing are for the very first time. And so again, something that they might have experienced that might not seem like a big deal to an adult really is a big deal to a young kid. And so I think those are the moments where you want to remove your glasses and remember that, listen, this is their first time, and they're probably feeling overwhelmed or sad or anxious about it. And so I should be there to care for them and to nurture them, not necessarily to like scold them for being too soft or something just because they're crying, So yeah.
I love that technique, and I'm going to try it next time I find myself kind of judging. And
Yeah.
that's a
I
great.
love that so much. Actually, just thinking about, have you ever been able to notice when someone else has their glasses on? Because I feel like that, as somebody who's mostly has her glasses off, I recognize when other people have their glasses on. And so I've been trying to find techniques to be like, let's take your glasses off together.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that is really hard. And often like the people who I love the most will have their glasses on, and I want to encourage them to take them off. And so I've been trying this technique, which I don't know, this is not a certified technique, but it has really worked, is to sort of start off by, before I share, saying what I need from the person with their glasses on. To say like what I really need from you and what would be so helpful in this moment, if you know what that thing is for you to be really supportive and really try to let me share all my feelings and just hold them for me for a couple minutes and just like take care of them and like tell me you love me. And like I like sometimes will feed the lines, and I found that it actually works.
I've heard of that technique before too, and I think that is brilliant.
Yeah, Allison, it's working because you're using an I statement, right? So an I statement is a way to really kind of disagree with someone in a very polite way, right? So telling them, I feel this way because, and you can, help me with this by, is really an effective communication technique. So, yeah.
I love that. I love knowing why it works. That's so helpful.
I love hearing all these therapy techniques that we got to practice now. Okay, let's take a question from the audience. We have one that came in. I looking forward to the panel discussion, especially interested in learning how to re-engage with a 14-year-old son. He literally went through puberty during the pandemic, has changed so much, not just physically, but also mentally. How can I help him present this new self to the world and get him to even want to re-enter the world in the first place?
I think, the biggest thing you can do with your son is really normalize this experience. Sometimes as a teen, we feel very isolated and we feel like we're the only one kind of going through that experience. We've all kind of been there. Anastasia, all of us. And so I think really being able to normalize that experience, and again, having those open discussions, right? Knowing that having those feelings, having certain feelings like that, it's okay, right? There's no bad feelings, sad, angry, that none of that is bad, but being able to kind of work through that and really being able to kind of put a temperature gauge on yourself, right? So I think that, yes, puberty is it's a difficult time. There's lots of different changes, but kind of normalizing that. And you can normalize that by, certain discussions, maybe watching a movie together and having an open discussion. Really, this is what's great. Humans, we love to be entertained, right? And I think that through books like Allison's and through movies, we can really kind of open up that discussion and normalize it.
Yes, and I was reminded when I saw this question come in earlier of a website that was created by Jed Foundation, which is a college mental health program that they do fantastic work, and it's called Seize the Awkward, seizetheawkward.org. And it gives parents starting points on conversations. In fact, there's a conversation starter generator on the website that you can say stuff like, I've noticed you've been down lately. What's going on? Or you generate a new one and it says, hey, we haven't talked in a while. How are you? It's like simple little things to get going. And I try to do that with mine too. I know they're getting into those times, the puberty years, which are very nerve-wracking, right, for a parent. But just noticing my son came home from school and seemed to be upset, and I'm just wanting to talk with him. So we go, I go to a place that's comfortable for him. Let's go to your room. Let's sit down and talk, and I eventually pulled it out of him. He really just didn't feel like going to swim practice because Monday they had to do these drills that he didn't like, and it was swim practice again. So we talked through it, and without taking the time to notice that I could tell he was down, sometimes we miss those opportunities to connect with our kids, but Seize the Awkward is a good source. Anybody else?
Yeah, I actually have a tip that I learned from this psychologist that I did a webinar with on eating disorders a few months ago. And she was telling me that it's also very helpful when you speak to your kids, especially if they're boys, because I think we can all agree that boys are just less likely to be super open about their emotions, especially at that age where they're going through puberty and all of these changes and are uncomfortable themselves with their changes. And so I think that what she was saying was one of the tips is to go on a walk or go on a drive or do something where you don't have to directly look at each other in the eyes, because that often helps with just making a more comfortable place for your kid to talk about their emotions, because it can be very intimidating to stare at your mom or dad in the eyes and tell them all of these things that are running through your mind, especially when they're like uncomfy thoughts. And so, yeah, just doing something where you don't have to directly look at one another, like going on a walk, going on a drive, going on a bike ride, or just doing something else, maybe playing a sport with your kid that they like to do. But yeah, just like Jen just said, finding a place that's comfortable for them and doesn't involve the intimidating gaze of your eyes, basically. Yeah.
Such good advice. My mom always used to say that she was so sad when each of us got our driver's license because she lost the time in the car. Mm-hmm. And the time in the car is when we would like sort of not be looking at each other. And I never thought about it. It was like she was able to recognize that as like a real loss in the relationship, because you didn't naturally have those opportunities. You have to like create them. Mm-hmm. So it's good to think about how can we create those opportunities.
Yep. Okay. Good ones. So another question that came in, we have, how do we feel about monitoring teens' texts, specifically when there's a concern about danger, risk, harm, etc.? There's already a history of anxiety, depression. Is it snooping? I haven't gotten into this realm yet, but one thing I could offer is that I recently watched a documentary called Childhood 2.0. It's on YouTube. I think it might be on Amazon Prime too, but Childhood 2.0 was a very eye-opening for me as a parent of younger kids that are entering into those phone years, maybe hopefully in the, who knows. And just all the dangers that they encounter online and child predators and different things. And it's impossible, I think, for parents these days to keep track of everything their kids are engaging online. And so this documentary opened up a resource that I've since engaged with called Bark accounts. And I actually worked with my kids to set it up where they, logged into their accounts and connected it. And I said, we're doing this to keep you safe online. And it's a resource, so maybe a starting point, but I think it really comes down to having those open conversations and making the time to connect in ways where the kid feels safe to open up about what's going on in their online life, right?
Jen, could you repeat the name of the resource? Because I think you cut out for a second when you said it.
Sure. It was called Bark. It's like, and their logo is a blue dog. But yeah, it sends you alerts if there's child history or email. I found it very, and opens up conversations, if something was flagged for violence in a YouTube video, and let's talk about this video. Did you watch it? What did you, my kids play a lot of video games online, so it tends to be like cartoon type violence. So, but it just allows you to follow what they're engaging with. It's a starting point, but I'd be curious, Anastasia, to hear your take on this, being a teen in this world.
I know. As soon as I saw monitoring text, I was like, oh, no. No, I mean, I think out of most of my friends, very few of them had parents that did look at their texts in middle school. I think that was also more of a middle school thing, because again, that's that transitional age where you start getting on social media and texting more people, and sometimes boys or girls or whoever comes into the picture, right? And so I think that's when parents do get a little bit more concerned about what teens are doing on their phones. And so I have had friends whose parents have looked through their phones and checked their messages at all times, basically every week. And I personally don't think that's the best way to go about things, just because they feel very violated and they feel like there's a lack of trust between themselves and the parent. And I think that can kind of rupture the relationship between themselves and their parents. And so I think that like Jen said, it's more important to have open conversations about their activity online and cultivate a place or an environment where trust exists and where also comfort exists, so that they feel open about talking about what they're doing online, right? Because if you start kind of, what's the word? I totally forgot the word, but basically if you try to insinuate that they're doing something shady or wrong or inappropriate online, they're going to be less likely to be open with you about these things. So I think that instead of trying to make it seem like they're doing something wrong, try to talk more comfortably and just open and chill about the whole online thing.
Well, I know in our kids' school, same school that Desi works there, they teach courses on digital citizenship and what it means to be a good online citizen, which is so critical. And my kids will bring up things that they talked about in that class, which I know they're picking it up and listening.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that if you set that boundary from the beginning, right? So, you buy a cell phone for your child and you set it up from the very beginning. Hey, these are going to be the rules. This is what's going to happen. I think, the child will know the expectations, and, it'll allow for that better communication that way. So I'm really true believer in setting those boundaries and those expectations from the very beginning when it comes to social media and cell phone use.
Yeah.
There's actually, can I pitch in another tip? Okay, yeah. Something that I thought of was also, I found that it's very valuable when my mom, or it was very valuable when my mom would explain to me the why behind something, like the why behind when she told me, for example, you can't stay out this late. Why? Well, because X, Y, and Z, right? Mm-hmm. She would explain it to me so I'd kind of understand where she's coming from and why abiding by her rules would benefit me. Because if you just tell your kid you can't use social media because it's bad, they're going to want to do it. And also that there's not much of a, there's not much justification when you just say it's bad or you're going to do inappropriate things on it or it's just going to harm you in some way. Instead, explain why it's healthy to maintain a tech life balance, right? And why it's good to minimize your activity on social media and why it's good to talk about things that concern you when they pop up on social media or just anywhere online, and so I think that the more informed your child is, the better decisions that they'll make for themselves because they understand how their actions are impacting themselves. Because I know that a lot of people who are adolescents, they don't always consider all the consequences or all the pros and cons and everything. They kind of just do and only realize the consequences once they happen. And so I think that it's really important, again, like I said before, to just explain the why. And I think that that'll result in your kids making better decisions for themselves and ultimately probably satisfying you and your desires regarding their tech usage and everything.
Yeah.
It helps to have an open communication. If your why is something that they say, well, what about this? But here's an example. When I got my driver's license, I lived in Massachusetts. And if you got it at 16 and a half, and between 16 and a half and 17, this was at the time, a very long time ago, you couldn't drive after midnight. That was the law. So my parents always said, you can stay out until midnight because we want you home by the time you're supposed to be home so that you're not behind the wheel. You're not in a car. You won't get pulled over. You won't get in trouble. Now, I thought that was unfair. I had friends who didn't have a curfew. So we had a workaround, which was that if I wanted to stay out with friends, I could stay at whoever's house I was at. I just wouldn't drive home. So I had to come up with another plan that wasn't breaking the law. They didn't feel comfortable with that. They didn't think that was right. So as long as we talked about it, we came up with other solutions and other ways to approach it. They understood where I was coming from. And I guess I sort of did understand where they were coming from. I never broke the rules. And I never even thought about it because I was like, they're hearing me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it comes down to the open conversation and the trust within, each other in the relationship. And we're in a tech world where it's not going away. So learning to balance, I think, is key. And I love what Anastasia said about really pointing out the pros of and more of us these days, I don't know about you guys, but crave that analog time where we're not on screens. And of course, we wouldn't be able to do stuff like this without them. But so to wrap up, in summary, just to me, it boils down to start the conversation, start it early, use different mediums to bring in these dialogues that you can have together and topics. Check out Allison's book, Taking Up Space, just came out yesterday, right? Or 2 days?
Tuesday yesterday.
I know you've been on a whirlwind tour. So, but definitely check it out. Link is down there. On Sunday, we would love for all of you to join us for our National Teen Show at 8 o'clock Eastern Time. It is a phenomenal collection of teenage stories, speaking on many different topics through many different forms of expression, and we're so proud of it. So I hope you join us. Anyone have anything else to share before we wrap up?
No, I think you did Jen, thank you again, for having me and bringing this all together. It was really nice just to have everyone's perspective, an artist, an author, and a teen, and then, just bringing this all together and really talking about it. And I think you summed up nicely. It's that open communication, finding those associations and how your child can learn and, really build on those coping skills. So find that association, find what clicks for your child. And keep those conversations going because they're so, so important.
Exactly. Start early and engage often. So thank you all so, so much for being here tonight. It was really good to have you. And thank you all for tuning in. And if you missed any portion of the show, there'll be a replay from our discussion tonight right here on Crowdcast. So thank you guys. Have a great evening.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye.